Hey everyone, Editor Ian here before we begin the episode. I wanted to start off with a bit of information that we somehow forgot to mention while we were recording the episode. Matt and Eric over at the Goblin's Corner recently invited us on for their 2-hour-long Q&A episode 200. I've added a link to the episode in this week's show notes. We wanted to take a minute to congratulate them on their success. We started our shows at about the same time, and we strongly encourage you to go and check them out if you aren't already listening to them. So, thank you, Eric and Matt, for your invitation, and congratulations on 200 episodes. Hopefully, we're all still around to meet up again at episode 300. Now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to Undercommon Taste. This is a podcast where we create and discuss homebrew content for tabletop RPGs.
We've had one economy, yes, but what about second economy?
I'm Ian Woodworth. I'm joined by my co-host James Daly, and today James decided to suggest that after our episode on economies, we should transition a little bit into some more mechanical stuff, not regarding money. So you want to take over on this one?
Yeah, so we did talk about the economy and what the player characters are going to be spending and using in their economy there. But there's also economy of action, economy of movement. And then you have player economy too. So how much can you expect your players to handle? How much do you want your players to handle? Because again, this is a mental economy as well, especially if we're going to be delving into game development or modular design for our games. How much can you throw at your players before they become overwhelmed? Because as they start forgetting stuff or stuff starts getting dropped off, that's going to affect gameplay and game satisfaction as well.
Right, yeah. That is one of those things that I don't think a lot of people really think about whenever they're designing or running their games.
Right.
Actual game designers probably do in a lot of cases, and that's something that comes out in playtesting. But one of the things that I have noticed from personal experience is that when it comes to actually running a game, your players can only really focus on playing the game for at most about 3 hours. There are going to be some groups that can absolutely hammer out an 8-hour marathon session or longer. I've heard of plenty of games that have gone longer than that. But I think when it comes to actually running a game and actually having a good quality game, I think 3 hours is about the limit for most groups.
For an adult, absolutely. If you're dealing with teens or older children, that probably drops closer to an hour and a half to an hour. Even if you're a fan of Critical Role, it seems like a huge marathon stretch, but watch how they play at the beginning of the session towards right about the time before they take a break towards the end, and you can see they start becoming distracted. They start jogging across the table. They start flipping through source material and looking at things, because the attention span's just attention span is a thing, and it does fray after a time. And yeah, even if you're in college, most lectures are going to run about 50 minutes. If you have a long lecture, it's not going to be longer than 2.5 hours generally, unless your professor's running way behind or he's sadistic. One of the two.
And typically, if you have a class that's going to be running longer than an hour and a half, your professor, if he doesn't hate you, is going to put a break in the middle of that.
Absolutely. And breaks are important. And that is one thing you can do if you do or are planning a longer section. Schedule a 10-15 minute break somewhere in the middle, or, as theme and game elements allow. But allow your players those kinds of breaks, because they will mentally check out otherwise. They just cannot help but to do it. It's the way our minds and bodies are built.
Yeah, and make sure that you get up away from the table on your breaks. Even if it's just walk it to the other end of the house and back and get a glass of water. If that's as much as you do, just do that, because that little bit of physical activity is really going to help a lot with, resetting your brain, getting you back into a mindset where you can sit down and actually focus.
And depending on where your game session is, like if Ian was going to run a marathon game at the library and he knew it was going to be like a 6-hour session, personally, I would suggest plan like a lunch break in the middle. So people have to get up. Even leaving the room, as Ian said, is great. But doing something that completely separates the player from the game and then give them time to work back up into the game, sit back down and readjust. But that full separation is a lot different than just 10 minutes at the table and you're still sitting there and you're still got the same surrounding, same environment. It really does make a big difference.
All right. So let's go a little bit more into some of the topics that you brought up, because James actually did an outline for this one as opposed to me. I mean, it was your idea, so
it was, yeah.
So I guess because we're already talking about player economy right now, we'll continue in on player economy a little bit more. One of the other points that you brought up is determining how much a player should have to manage in order to be able to play the game. How much of it is player side focused versus how much is storyteller side focused. Some games are GM-less. They don't have a storyteller and all of the players share that responsibility equally. And some games like D&D are very much storyteller focused in a mechanical sense, so that the DM is the DM is the one that has to keep track of the rules and adjudicate the rules, and often is the one that is de facto the person who is remembering and reminding the other players of the rules.
And that is the thing. And if you're playing that type of game, that becomes the DM GM's sole task, is just kind of managing all of the background rules. And again, if you were playing, a video game or a computer console game type thing, the GM is the computer at that point, and it's a lot. And so doing all of that, the GM would rarely have the extra mental spoons or the aptitude to also juggle a player at the same time. Some can, but generally not terribly well. And so the question is like, how many things do you want your players to actually juggle? Some things we just naturally drop off. I can think of maybe 1 or 2 campaigns and one-shots maybe where like encumberment and weight capacity in a D&D game was considered. So do you want your players to consider weight? What's their economy going to be? Do they have to manage their health pool, magic or mana or, magic levels? What kind of equipment are they carrying? Do they have to have like perfect, or are they just going to like have a standard like barbarians always have a club, or do I have a club? Do I have a thing? Do I have like the 12 other things I've picked up with me? Am I managing that stock and inventory? Do I have to manage and keep track of reputation and groups that I'm dealing with? So, I mean, all of these things can become overwhelming. All of them are great elements for a game. They're amazing elements for the game. And we've talked about all of these at different points in our podcast. But to throw them all together at once quickly overloads a player.
It does. And I mean, there are some other examples too. Like if you're playing a game where your weapons and armor have condition, where your equipment will gradually break down. If you're having to keep track of ammunition, like if you're playing a ranger and you have to keep track of how many arrows you have, things like that. And like you said, there are aspects of that can very quickly just overwhelm, and it becomes so much bookkeeping that you lose sight of the fun. And so you have to find that sweet spot. You have to find that point in the middle where you can keep track of the things that you are wanting to keep track of for mechanical reasons, while still allowing the story to remain in the forefront.
Right. And there's a way to do both. I mean, look at games we've played from being little to now. A game like War. Here, you get half a deck, I get half a deck. We're going to flip a card. High card wins. I played War for hours on and as a little kid with my siblings. This is what we did, Oh, my card, aha, I win. Super simple mechanically. Not a whole lot of hand waving. Again, something like D&D, more complex. If you've done something like Warhammer, oh my God, the amount of stuff you have to juggle in Warhammer is, I mean, you've got math, you've got each unit, you've got army points, you've got, area of effect, abilities, and Warhammer can get super murky. It's a great game. So there is a balance. And if you're going to try to mod a game, I would say pick 2, maybe 3, and do them very, very well. Ian was talking about weapon breakdown. I love the idea that, you know what, I might be playing and maybe my weapon fails me. Oh no, and then do I have a backup? What else is I love that as a game mechanic. You don't see it in a lot of games, especially tabletop games, because it is hard to keep track of. And again, if you have computers to help you with that, if you have a tablet that's going to run, an Excel sheet, those are ways you can kind of offload some of that, mental math and mental economy the players have to manage. And it does help. What we talked about earlier, I believe it was when we were with Goblin's Corner, but minion rules, where you just throw a ton of minions on the table, but instead of like tracking the health for each minion and like, okay, this one's got 3, this one's got 5, this one's got 10, one hit and they're gone. They're on the table, you can hit them. You still get that effect of, oh my God, there's a ton of stuff here, but it's very easy to manage quickly.
Yeah, and with minions, it adds to that heroic element because there is very little that feels as satisfying as dropping a fireball on a cluster of enemies.
Yeah.
And it just obliterates them.
Watch them all melt.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a wonderful feeling. And if you okay, well, I don't want my players to deal with that. So you take all those minions out, that really is a moment your players don't get to have, which is unfortunate. But again, too, if you do it wrong, and an example of one of the first D&D campaigns I ever played, we were all level 1 characters, and our DM literally threw 30 skeletons at us. I've mentioned this before. He said afterwards that he expected us to go back into a mausoleum and kind of bottleneck everyone. But we literally battled for almost 4 hours fighting 30 skeletons as level 1 characters because, we couldn't hit anything. Our dice were rolling really cold that day, and it took forever, and it was too much. And it was overwhelming. My first campaign I ran, I put my players into an underground labyrinth, and I had every expectation that, okay, you're walking through a door, there's a door that goes straight, there's a door left, a door right. Okay, they picked a door. There'd be another room with multiple doors. And I had every expectations for one of the players to pull out a pen and paper and start making a map. And they didn't. And so they got lost in this labyrinth. And that was, again, another 2 or 3 hour, just walking in circles. They literally were walking in a large circle because they kept doing a loop. And they were so flustered and burnt out by the end of the thing that they were like, oh no, we've got to quit. We're done. And I'm like, okay, so, as a GM, I kind of guided them out, but it overwhelmed my party.
Yeah, and that is a mistake that you have to make as a GM in order to really learn the lesson, I think.
Yeah.
I have absolutely done that too. Like, the very first game that I ever ran was a game of Paranoia 2nd Edition, and I was running from a module that I found online, and I didn't realize, because of my inexperience with running tabletop games, I didn't realize that the module, as it was written, was designed for 5 or 6 sessions.
Oh, wow.
And so I was working my way through it on the impression that this was all going to be a single session because I didn't have the context to say, hey, this is unrealistic to reach in a 4-hour game session. And the way that Paranoia is set up is it is very bureaucratic. There's lots of red tape. There's lots of paperwork involved. That's part of the game. And basically the entire first session was supposed to be going through all of the bureaucratic bullshit to get your standard issued gear so that you could actually go and do the thing. Because that is the sort of game that Paranoia 2nd Edition was. It was very much the...
It's a game for IRS nerds.
It was, and,
I would totally play
it. Think of it, if you've ever watched the movie Office Space.
Okay, yeah.
The office mentality of Office Space is the same sort of mentality that you have on the non-combat side of Paranoia 2nd Edition.
Oh, wow.
And so basically what they had to do was they had to wait in this one big long line to get the requisition form to fill out, to take to the next area, to turn in, to get their checkout chit, to go to another area to actually check out their gear. And during all of this, one of my players, actually Kelly, who was on a few weeks ago, she decided that her character was going to try to circumvent the whole waiting in line thing, crawl through the air ducts into the storage area and just get her gear.
Not a bad idea.
Not a bad idea.
I'd be tempted, but I'm sure there was security involved.
Well, there was, but she botched one of her rolls as she was climbing through the air ducts, and she thought that she was in the right spot, and so she opens the vent and drops out, and she ends up landing on the counter in front of the bureaucrat that she was supposed to be waiting in line to see. And then as a result had to go back to the back of the line.
That reminds me of that scene from A Breakfast Club.
And I could tell by the end that everyone who had agreed to play Paranoia with me was feeling very frustrated and not having a lot of fun because I didn't understand the parameters of the game yet.
Right.
And so I also didn't have the experience to, hand wave rules and say, okay, we are just going to have all of this bullshit happen off stage so that we can get to the exciting part.
Fair. And that is another thing, too. Another thing that we have spoken many times of, and we are huge proponents, but that zero session is really, really important. Even if it's a 0.5 session and you do it quickly before your first sit-down game session, like, hey, we're all here, let's just get some quick agreements. Are we going to use homebrew? Is it rules as written? Do we want to track everything? Is that going to be too much for you all? What do you all want out of this game? That is a very important thing to have an understanding on for everybody with. Talking about player economy and how much they have, depending on if you have older players or new players or what kind of background your players are coming from, is how much role play do you want involved? Is everyone just going to sit down there and, hey, we're going to use real world names? On the table, we'll have maybe a mini on a map, but otherwise it's going to just be theater of the mind and we're just a bunch of friends sitting at a table. Or, if you cast a spell, do you have to sit there and use a different language and wave your fingers at the table because that's what your wizard or sorcerer would be doing? Are you actually going to go full role play with different voices and names, and you can only talk to a character if you mention the character's name, otherwise it's just considered off-table talk. I've seen both of these rules play either way. And again, that kind of role play can be great fun. It is a ton of fun to do if everyone's on the same page and they know to do it. But if you're going to have them manage all of that as well, that is mental energy they are devoting towards that. So they're going to have less mental energy to devote towards other things like bookkeeping, number counting, that kind of stuff as well.
Right. And of course, especially in games like D&D, there are also mechanical aspects to your character that you have to keep track of. Like, if you're playing a spellcaster, you have to know what your spells do. You have to know how many spell slots you have. You have to keep track of when you use your spell slots. Elements like that, if you have class or racial abilities that are so many times per short rest, so many times per long rest, so many times equal to your proficiency modifier, there are so many different things like that you have to keep track of. Talking back about some of the older editions, I think in 4th edition, you had daily powers, you had encounter powers, you had, I think, standard powers, which were things that you could do every turn. But encounter powers, you could do it once per encounter. Daily powers, you could do it once per day. And so you had to keep track of, have I used this yet? Is this considered a new encounter? Did this reset? And things of that nature, there are, what am I getting at? I think this is one of those systems matters things.
It really
where
does.
you have to acknowledge that if you're going to be playing a certain game, that there will be a certain amount of tracking required from the players.
Yeah, and that comes back to that zero session. Say, understand, hey, we're going to be playing this. If we're playing with these rule sets that we all agree on, here's a responsibility that the players have. And if you build these types of rule sets or you're really going heavily into these, there are, various apps that will help things. There are ways to keep track of things. Another great example, Magic the Gathering. You've got your mana cards, you've got your spell cards, you've got your tokens, you've got your counters, you've got your poisons, you've got all these things. And I've seen this develop over time. I remember vaguely like when, 1st edition Magic was, and that was back like in the early mid 90s and people were playing,
Yep.
They didn't have a whole lot of things. And now like, oh, I've got a counter. So people will have like pennies that they count for their tokens. So instead of like keeping that mentally remembered, they just have a little token they can drop on the table. And 1 penny is a +1 counter. 2 pennies is a +2 counter. Their life, they'll get a D100 or, they'll get a percentile die and they'll count down and they'll use that as a counter. And using those types of things helps that economy a lot because you have that physical thing that offloads for your players. Again, kind of wanting to brush away from Hasbro, but D&D Beyond has a great app, and I'm sure there's other apps out there I need to find that are great for tracking your spells, your at-rest abilities, your hit pool, all of that, your inventory. And especially for a newer player, it's really easy because they get confused. They can just go to their phone, flip over. This is what I have. Here's the description. It's a little more difficult when you have more homebrewed items in because they have to enter those things manually, but they're still there. And so these are things that the player has to deal with, not so much for the character. And now, again, talking about economies that the character or the critters on the table have to deal with. Again, more than just gold, silver, electrum pieces. You have reputation or karma economy. Again, great examples of this are Fallout, Final Fantasy to some degree. Trying to think, Baldur's Gate kind of hits and misses with that one. Trying to think of games, XCOM. If you played XCOM War of the Chosen, you start developing pluses and minuses with different factions. These are that reputation economy is huge. Obviously, your money economy, your spell economy. If you want to deal with encumbrance, if that is a thing you want in your game, how much can your player carry? That was actually one game that Ian and I were kicking around for a little bit, was we wanted to run a timed dungeon, but we wanted that encumbrance in there because we wanted to make the players think about, okay, I can grab this treasure here, but I can't grab that treasure there because it's too big or it's too heavy, which is worth more. And I was kind of inspired by that by Darkest Dungeon because you only have so much space in your bag that you start throwing in all of your loot. And pretty soon you have to start throwing away like your things that can heal you or things that help you, your torches that help you see in the dungeon. And you start deciding, well, is this important or is this more important? And that can be a lot of fun for a character too, especially when you start dealing with risk and reward ratios.
Yeah. And there are some other games. I can't remember the name of the game specifically. It might be Mouse Ritter. It might be Knave. It's one of the OSR games. I remember listening to an interview. It was either with Chris McDowell or with Eco over on the Lost Bay. And the game has a grid inventory system.
Okay.
So you're not tracking weight, you're tracking the size of the items. Sort of like with Diablo, where you have a grid and you have to fit the items that you've picked up into the slots, into the inventory. And one of the things that they do with tracking health is rather than you having hit points, if you take damage, you lose inventory slots.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So like one of the examples that I remember from the interview is like you're trudging through a swamp and you have some sort of fatigue set in because you're walking through the swamp, and that is represented by pockets of your inventory getting filled with mud.
Oh, that would be awesome. And I think if I was running that particular game, I would actually set it up much like Diablo has, and I would give my players, maybe a laminated piece of grid paper that they could either, mark out or block out when they have things. And so that way they could track that inventory that way. That would actually be a really fun mechanic. I love that. And yeah, I am definitely due for another playthrough of Diablo 2 at some point soon.
Yeah. So talking back about the post-apocalyptic game that I've been working on personally for a while, I've been toying with various different carrying capacity, encumbrance sort of rules. And one of the options that I came up with that I may or may not implement depending on how complex it turns out to be during playtesting, once I finally get to playtesting this, is you have a carry capacity as an individual, and it's based on your brawn score, how strong you are.
Okay.
But your actual capacity is determined by the containers that you're carrying. So if you have a backpack, the backpack can hold X number of things. If you have a fanny pack on top of that, that holds an extra X number of things. If you have an ammo bag, it holds an extra X number of things. And you can have so many containers, and your containers can have so much capacity. And as long as the total capacity, so like you can have more capacity in containers than you are actually physically able to carry, but you're not going to be bothered by it unless you exceed that number.
Okay.
But also, if you have a smaller capacity in containers than you have in your brawn ability to carry, you still can't carry more things because you have no place to put them.
Gotcha.
And, I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it. I have done a much better job of writing it down, I promise. But that is the idea behind one of the mechanical options that I came up with. And that seemed to me to be the most intuitive way, because this is a post-apocalyptic game. This is something where the things that you carry are supposed to matter. And so you are supposed to optimize the things that you carry, and you have to make very meaningful decisions about the things that you take and the things that you leave behind so that you can continue in the setting, because that's what survival is all about,
Yeah. No, for the life of me, I can't remember the game it was, but I've played a game like that. It was a video game where you had that grid type system, much like Diablo or what you're talking about. But then you had, like, in that system, you had a food bag or a magic components bag. So you had that food bag, and you could stick 50, rations of food in that food bag. So you could carry 50 rations of food versus, only being able to carry 25 if you filled up each slot in your backpack or whatever it was. So you'd have your food bag, you'd have your magic item bags, you'd have your money pouch, and you had a couple other things. So yeah, you had a bag in a bag, and as long as things fit in the bag, it didn't take any extra inventory spots other than the bag space, so the container space. So yeah, that is very familiar. Going along with the different types of backpack, another game I'm playing currently is Quasimorph. I'm playing that just on my own. That's not on Twitch. But that's one of those things where you're going through and you're looting things as you go on each mission. Generally, you have a backpack that's like 2 by 12, so 2 rows and 12 columns. Occasionally, you can find a 3 by 12 or a 4 by 12, and those are gold because you can carry more stuff back that you use to make other things. Or like one of the backpacks is 2 by 12, but it gives you an extra weapon slot, and the weapons generally take 4 to 6 of your bag spaces, so they're really expensive to carry. So if you have an extra weapon slot, that carries. So again, this is the type of thing, what type of economy, if you're making your own game or if you're modding your own game, what things do you want your players to value? Can they just loot everything? Can they just be pack rats? Everyone gets a bag of holding. You don't have to worry about weight encumbrance, and you can pick up whatever the heck you want. Or you only have certain things you need to carry, and you have to pick. So what's important to you? What's important in this world you've created? Going through, even when talking about like money economy, things I like to see that I think are fun, but can be a lot for players to manage is, what if you have different nations or realms, and so you have an exchange rate between areas. So a gold piece, here is not worth the same as a gold piece there. And so now you have to figure out what that exchange rate between that. Maybe it's like a gold piece in the capital is worth 1.2 gold pieces on one of your rim nations or one of your tiny little hamlets. And so now you're going to go and exchange money to get everything balanced when you're trading. If you're at a table with a bunch of math geeks and they like doing that kind of stuff, it can be a lot of fun, especially if you're trying to haggle and barter how much your party is going to get paid for doing a mission. If not, they're probably not going to like it. They'll probably just drop it, and you'll probably just go back to the standard 1 gold piece with 1 gold piece wherever you're at.
Right, yeah, and, talking about some real world parallels there with regards to your gold pieces, it could just be that gold pieces are bigger in this place than they are in that place. So they have more gold in them, and therefore they're worth more.
Yeah. Now, I think it was in 2nd edition. I can't remember. I think they also had a weight in 3rd. But your gold used to count against your encumbrance weight. And that's one of the big things where, like I said, people just started chucking out, encumbrance weight in general, because you could carry a single gold piece, and it would be easier than carrying, 100 or 1,000 copper pieces, because you had this giant bag of copper or a single gold piece. But then if everyone was only paying in copper and you're carrying all this weight, you're carrying a copper mine with you wherever you go, so you can pay for all your things. That counted against your encumbrance weight. So how much money are you actually carrying? That was something the developers built into the games, but I quickly saw just discarded because it was too much for players to manage.
Yeah, that is a very good example of something that mechanically hindered gameplay.
Yeah. Great idea, though. Love the idea.
It was a great idea. I mean, it's something that if you want to add the realism back to the game, you can absolutely do. However, that is something that will drag down gameplay. It will slow everything down.
Absolutely.
Because that is something that they have to figure out, that they have to do the math for. That's part of the reason why I decided to try going into okay, there is a set unit of capacity, and everything is set up to either be so many individual items per unit or so many units per individual item, depending on the size of it. So, like, if it's a food item, say MREs, just for an example, MREs might be 4 to a unit. So one block of your capacity can hold 4 MREs, or it can hold 100 rounds of ammunition.
Yeah.
Or you might have to use 2 units in order to hold 1 handgun, or 4 units to hold a rifle, or 2 units to hold a knife, or 8 units to hold a rocket launcher, something like that. And so by doing that, I am getting rid of all of the math required in giving everything a weight, and you have to calculate how much everything weighs and compare that to a number that is derived from your skills to see, can I carry this much? But it also accounts for items which are lightweight but bulky, because there are some things that they're not heavy, they're awkward.
Fair, yes.
Anyone who has moved furniture knows that. So, like, a full-size pillow and, like, a loaf of bread, like a small loaf of bread might have roughly the same weight, but a small loaf of bread is about 10% the size of a full-size pillow. So it's going to take up less
loaf
space.
Of bread. I'm thinking like a full-size body pillow. Okay, wait, yeah. If it's just a head pillow, yeah, I could see that. I'm thinking like one of those full-size like body pillows that you have to like hug to carry, just because it's like 4.5 feet long.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a dense loaf of bread. But no,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. So I mean, does your player have an extra arm? I mean, that extra arm would go a long way for economy.
Yeah. And then, you would end up also having things where, like, if you have holsters for your weapons, that frees up inventory because it is its own designated container that sits out of the way.
Yeah.
If it's a bigger weapon, does it have a sling? Does it have a strap that you can use to carry it? Something that will, not take up bag space and will not be held in the hands. Things like that.
So this does bring up another form of economy, is your character's action economy. If you're building a game, if you're designing a game, if you're modding a game, how much do you want your players to be able to do in a turn? How long is a turn? So again, most of our tabletop games, you get an action, a bonus action, a reaction in any given turn. Some games, hey, you get an and movement. Some games, if you're playing a board game, you have your action, you have your movement. So you roll your die, you move your squares, and your action is you draw a card and you do what the card says, advance to go, advance to boardwalk, go directly to jail. That is your movement and your action. Now, if you have something, hey, I have movement, action, go to jail, go directly to jail, but I have a get out of jail free card. Now you've built in a reaction as well. So how much do you expect your players to do in any given turn? Can they do offense as an action? Is defense an action? Or something like supportive role? Like, okay, I punch the bad guy in the nose, and then I throw an extra clip of ammo to my marksman who's outside, who's like 20 feet away. Can they do both of those things in the turn? Or is, taking the time to see where your marksman is, that much energy to throw that correctly, but now you can't punch, or you punch, you're going to throw the thing, but you don't have time to actually see where, so you're just going to throw it and now roll a random chance die to see how close you get. These are all kind of things to kind of balance and consider as well.
Yeah, because the more things that your character can do in a round, the more complex the game is, the more moving parts you have to keep track of.
Yeah.
I think Monster of the Week does this very well.
Yes.
And this also plays into the action economy of your player group versus the NPC group that opposes them, and how in D&D sometimes you can end up with very lopsided fights because the party simply just outnumbers the enemy, and therefore they get so many more actions than the enemy does, so the enemy doesn't get a chance to act.
Yeah.
Monster of the Week does this very well in a way that whenever you do a thing, depending on your level of success of the thing that you're doing, there is automatically a built-in reaction to your action. So your opposition in combat in Monster of the Week, they don't get their own turns. They react to your turn every turn.
Yeah.
And so if you're fighting something, it's built in that whenever you use the kick some ass move in Monster of the Week, by default, you take 1 harm because that is the monster hitting you back.
Makes sense.
Now, if you succeed well enough, you can choose the take less harm option, which means that you take 1 less harm than you normally would. If it's a standard monster that would only deal 1 harm, then what you have done is you have acted in such a way that you have attacked successfully enough to avoid the counterattack.
Yeah.
And so it's baked right in, and it helps combat in Monster of the Week go so fast.
It really does. And again, that is a very, very well done system.
Yeah. Powered by the Apocalypse absolutely does that very well. Now, I like D&D. I like the way that it goes. It does get very clunky and bogged down a lot, especially whenever you're dealing with people who sometimes don't pay the best attention to what's going on the table, and they have to suddenly it's their turn and they have to figure out what's going on.
Right.
Not that any of my players would ever do that.
No, never.
But, that's one of the dangers of having a very complex system like that, is that it bogs down when you get into combat because there are so many moving parts. And because each time you have something going on, you get prompted for a roll, and then you have to wait for the roll to determine whether or not there's any success or failure.
Right. Another system that can get really clunky, again, going back to both Warhammer and Magic the Gathering, you've got, so Magic, you've got your card draw, you've got your land phase, you've got your upkeep, you cast your spells, then your opponent can cast reactions, and then you attack, and then you've got a secondary upkeep, and then you end your turn. In Warhammer, it's been a while, but you've got, again, your movement, you've got your shooting phase, you've got a magic or a psyker phase. There's another phase in there too, I forget what it is. Then your enemy response phase, and then if you've put any characters on Overwatch, that's another reaction phase. And so a single turn, and then especially with Warhammer, where you're moving, 50, 60, 100 pieces, a half inch each as you're scooching them across that can take a long time for a single turn.
Yeah, and, even going into, say, Warhammer Fantasy, which is the role-playing game, as opposed to the war miniature game, Warhammer Fantasy is far more complex than even D&D is.
Yes. Great game, though. Amazing game.
It is an amazing game, but, whenever you take damage, there are tables for the type of wounds that you receive and the penalties that you get for getting injured in certain body parts, and it gets real gritty. It's a very granular system. It goes into all of the details, and if that's the sort of game that you want to play, have at it.
And there are days where I'm all for that game. The other thing they have, and it's something that Ian and I both love that gets skipped out of a lot of our games, morale checks. You take a certain amount of damage, well now, are you staying and fighting or are you running for the hills? So a morale check is another piece of player economy that you have to manage if you put that into your game. And again, Ian and I, we love morale checks. We think they're great, but sometimes the game's too much as it is, so we don't always get to do morale checks.
Right. So one of the things that you put on this is the question, does speech require an action?
Yeah.
And this is something that I do want to take a minute and talk about. Because this is something that, in theory, you can talk while you're doing all of your other actions. Sure. Now, there are certain actions, like casting a spell with verbal components, that you can't have a conversation while you're doing it. And the one thing that I will add is that quite often, whenever you have people who are doing these sort of turn-based actions, the things that they are trying to say take much longer than one round to say.
Absolutely. Especially if they're in combat. If you have that one person at the table, well, I'm just saying this, it doesn't take 6 seconds. Okay, I tell you what, run around the building 4 times, come back in, and tell me what you want to say. Tell me if you can communicate clearly in 6 seconds while you're breathing heavily and sweating.
Right. Yeah. It's not as easy as it sounds. But there are certain things where the thing that you are saying, let's say that you're trying to persuade an enemy to stand down, to not attack you. In Dungeons and Dragons, that is an action to do because you are forcing a skill check.
Yeah.
And to me, that is appropriate.
Yeah.
Because you are foregoing any other thing. You have to present your body language in addition to your actual language in such a way that they will believe your attempt to persuade them.
Absolutely.
And so I think that having that as an action and have it take your entire action to attempt makes sense.
Yeah, I'm with that. I would say personally, any speech that's going to require a skill check, a performance, a deception, a persuasion, anything, like I said, that requires a skill check should be a full action. If you're going to talk to a teammate or something, get down, drink that, look out. 2 or 3 words, maybe a bonus reaction or a reaction. More than 4 words, you're probably back into full action range again, just because communication takes a lot. Talk to someone in a car when you're not looking at them, or, if they're in a different room. Even if you're at a party, and you've got things, it's hard to communicate properly in that kind of situation. And so in order to do that, it's going to take more time and more effort, not only to speak, but to be heard.
That is true. But the thing that I am going to be focused on whether or not they can say that much is it mechanically significant?
Okay, fair.
So, like, if they're passing a potion off to somebody and saying, here, drink this, I'm not going to have their saying, here, drink this, take any additional action.
No,
because they're already taking that action of handing over the potion.
Right, okay.
Right?
Well, I figured those would go together, but yes, no, that does make sense.
So the act of me handing off a potion to somebody else, that action by itself, without any words, is visually enough to convey the meaning without the words.
Oh, you didn't just want me to hold this for you? You didn't say anything. I'm just holding the potion. Why?
Well, I mean, it would seem obvious to me that if we are adventuring together and we're in a world where health potions exist, we would know what a health potion looks like. And if I have been kicked to shit and my ally reaches out a healing potion to me, that seems pretty obvious that they were wanting me to take and drink it.
Fair. I'm just fully embracing the tism. You didn't say to drink it. You just handed it. I thought me to hold. Done. And this is why my character dies.
Yes. This is why I bake your mushroom in the sun.
Yes. But no, that makes sense. If your words accompany an action and they are congruent with each other, that should be fine. Another consideration that I actually just now thought of as we were talking about this is a round is supposed to take roughly 6 seconds. In D&D, it's different with other systems. How much can you actually say in that amount of time? So, I mean, again, handing you a potion, here, drink this, that's that same action. If I'm saying trying to hand a potion while giving, a Shakespeare soliloquy, that's probably not going to mesh so terribly well.
Right. I would agree with that.
I think we covered most of the points of economy. Like I said, it is something that, especially if you're wanting to design and build your own systems, you absolutely should spend some time considering. I think a lot of people that are just kind of trying to mod or homebrew, they don't really consider how much can be done, or they try to get too much in all at once. Again, all of these things by themselves are great. All of these things, 2 or 3 together, are really, really good and can be a ton of fun. A lot of them work wonderfully together. But if you throw everything at your players all at once, you can quickly overwhelm your characters, and what could be a great idea simply gets bogged down and people won't enjoy it because it's too much. And so playtesting is also very important because you can see what kind of things resonate with your players, what shines, what doesn't, and maybe you can parse them back for system part 2 or another system. Because again, also, every table is going to be a little different, and players might like that carry capacity economy, while other players might want more of that gritty, economical, exchange rate economy and capacity. And depending on which group at the table, you can have different things to kind of modularly set in or take away as your group sees fit.
Right. I would absolutely agree on those points. So yeah, I think we have hit the end of what we needed to talk about today. So thank you everyone for listening. If you have any comments, suggestions, or ideas, please send us an email, undercommontaste@gmail.com, or come join us on our Discord. You can find a link to our Discord, plus all of our social media accounts through our website, undercommontaste.com. You can also find links there to our itch page, undercommontaste.itch.io, or our Patreon, patreon.com/undercommontaste. And both those places have ways for you to help support the show financially.
Awesome. If this is your first time listening, we're very happy you found us. You can find us on your podcatcher of choice. Just search Undercommon Taste. Also, Ian did mention itch.io. The Solo But Not Alone 5 bundle is still up and active. Proceeds go for mental health and gamers' mental health, but you can get over 100 different solo-capable RPGs, tabletop RPGs. So you can play them by yourselves. A lot can be played with more than one character, but you can get over 100 game titles for $10 or more if you choose to donate more. But it's a great bundle, and the proceeds go to a really good cause for mental health awareness, which I think is great. Also, you can catch me on Monday and Thursdays on twitch.tv/undercommontaste. On Mondays, I'm playing through Darkest Dungeon, and on Thursdays, I am playing through the classic Neverwinter Nights.
Stay safe, everyone, and we will see you all again in 2 weeks.
Happy gaming.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Undercommon Taste. Our theme song is Massacre Anne, written and performed by Mary Kroll and used with permission. You can find Mary online at marykroll.bandcamp.com or on Patreon at patreon.com/Dr. Mary C. Kroll. Our logo is by David Sutherland. You can find more of David's work on deviantart.com/David Sutherland or on instagram.com/Willex_73. We'll be back in 2 weeks, so stay safe, and we'll see you then.